welcome to episode 6 of Learning Photography, the third in the series of 3 episodes in which we're laying the foundation for you taking control of your camera. So with episode 7 we can start actually taking pictures and working with the exposure triangle in actual practice with your camera in your hand, or in this case you looking over my shoulder with my camera in my hand. In this episode, we're going to focus on the physical controls that are on your camera, and only really the physical controls that we are going to need to make sure that we're familiar with in order to do the exercises that are going to follow. We're not going to worry about the on-off switch. I assume you know where that is. We're not going to talk about the menu button. We're going to talk about those things that we're going to need to be able to access to change aperture, to change shutter speed, change modes, shooting modes, and so on. All cameras, from high-end compact cameras through micro four thirds cameras, mirrorless cameras, and DSLRs, both low-end consumer DSLRs and high-end professional DSLRs, share these same buttons or dials. They're just in different places. And in some cases, they're very close. From one camera brand to another, they're very close to where they are. There's some things that just sort of make sense. So the first thing, we're going to talk about the mode dial, how we change our shooting modes. We're going to talk about reviewing our images and how we can change the display on that review screen. We're going to talk about the shutter button, probably one of the most important ones that actually lets us take the picture. And we're going to talk about how we access a button or feature to change the ISO. And likewise, how do we change the aperture and shutter speed when we're in manual mode on your camera. So let's take a look. Let's get to it. I have images of a Canon Rebel, consumer level Canon DSLR, a Nikon, a consumer level Nikon camera, and my Olympus OMD EM1, just so I can compare some of the dials and some of the buttons that are on each of those machines. I don't have, there are a host of other cameras that are popular now. I don't have those, but the buttons are going to be pretty much the same. The dials are going to be pretty much the same. So let's start with the mode dial. We want to choose what mode we want to shoot in. So if you look at this image right here, this is the mode dial on a Nikon camera, and you see the green auto button. Now you may be shooting in auto, and as I said in the last episode, that's fine. Auto is a very good, especially on newer cameras. It's amazing the images you can create with shooting in auto mode. But if you paid a lot of money for a DSLR or for a mirrorless camera, then you should take advantage of some of the other features of your camera, and perhaps that's why you're watching this. So on this particular mode dial on the Nikon, we see below the auto, or to the right, as I'm looking at it, we see a bunch of little icons, and those are the basic shooting modes. There's a picture of a head for portrait mode. There's a person running for sports, fast-moving things, and a tulip or a flower for macro. And so if we choose, for example, the sporting mode, then we're telling the camera that we want to freeze the action of somebody running, children, animals, somebody in sports, or whatever. So those are still automatic, however. We're not exercising any control except for choosing that. Above that, though, we see PSAM, program mode, shutter priority mode, aperture priority mode, and manual. And those modes are the creative modes, and the ones that we will use to really take control of the camera. The P mode allows us to override what the camera chooses. It's kind of an automatic mode. The shutter priority and aperture priority are semi-automatic. We choose to control one while the camera takes care of the other. Manual mode, you're in charge. Okay, so let's look at the same dial on a Canon camera. Canon chooses to call shutter priority time value, so they have TV, and they call aperture priority AV for aperture value. M is still manual, P is still program, and you see the icons down here for the basic modes. Okay, so that's the mode dial. Now, just real quickly, let's look at the mode dial on my EM1. You just see PASM. and no icons here, but an art mode and a screen mode. And when you choose screen mode, then on the LCD you get choices of a whole bunch of different ways to shoot, just like you do on the Canon and the Nikon. All right, so now let's go to ISO. The other part of the exposure triangle is ISO. We want to be able to change that as well, or control it. So on this particular Rebel model, the ISO button is right here on top. If you press that, it's going to display a menu on the back of the screen. And so here, you will then use these buttons, which here are marked WB for white balance and AF for autofocus and so on. It's sort of like the 12 o'clock position, the 3 o'clock position, the 6 o'clock position, the 9 o'clock position. You'll use those to navigate across the choices for ISO. And that's true again on most cameras, even though there may be nothing there as on the Nikon camera. There's no letters here, but you still see a 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock position that lets you navigate menus. So when you choose ISO on a Nikon camera, you will use those to navigate to the one you want. And on a Nikon camera, there's no dedicated ISO button. That is on the Nikon camera that I have a picture of, and the Nikon cameras with which I have experience, having worked with students with Nikons. But rather, you press the I button, the info button over here on the left, and it will bring up on the LCD screen a menu over here, and one of the choices on the menu is ISO. And that's where you can choose auto ISO or a particular ISO value, as we talked about in the last episode. Okay, so that is ISO. And that we're going to be changing quite frequently, so we need to know where that is. So let's go back up to our Nikon camera, and the next thing we want to do is see how do we, once we've chosen, say for example S for shutter priority, or on a Canon camera TV for time value shutter priority. So that means that we're going to choose the shutter speed. We're going to let the camera choose the aperture. We've presumably already set the ISO to, say, 200 if it's a bright sunny day, or maybe 400 if it's a kind of overcast or cloudy. Once you've done that on the Nikon, let's get back here to the Nikon image. In the upper right here, you see there's a dial. And what you'll do when you're in shutter priority is turn that dial. And as you turn it to the right, it will make a faster shutter speed, because you are removing the, or in other words, reducing the amount of time that the shutter is open. And if you turn it to the left, L for light, you're actually adding light. So you're slowing down the shutter speed so that it opens and closes slowly. So that's how it works on this particular model of a Nikon. A Canon camera, that dial is up here on the top. And so when I have it set to shutter priority, if I turn this dial to the right, it's presumably is going to remove light by speeding up the shutter speed. If I dial it to the left, I'm doing this with my index finger, then it's adding light by slowing down the shutter speed. And the camera is in turn choosing the aperture. And so if we, however, go to aperture priority, AV on the Canon, A on most other cameras, then turning this dial is going to change the aperture. And again, if I dial it to the right, I am removing light by making the hole smaller and smaller and smaller. Remember, a small f-stop number, 16, 11, so on, is removing light. And if I want more light, I go to the left, L for left. And it makes the hole bigger, the aperture value smaller and the number smaller, but the hole gets bigger. And likewise, on the Nikon, I will use that same dial I use for shutter speed for aperture when I'm in aperture priority. Okay, that leaves manual mode. In manual mode, I am going to control both aperture and shutter speed. And so I only have one dial. So how do I do that? Well, by default on most cameras, on this Canon, that dial by default typically will adjust the shutter speed when you're in M, manual mode. And so by adjusting the shutter speed with that, I'm doing the same thing as I did before. But how do I change the aperture? Well, typically what happens is you have to press a button in conjunction with turning this dial. So if we look at the Canon, the rear of the Canon, I have to press this AV button, the plus with the plus minus icon on it. I hold that in with my thumb while I'm turning the dial on the top. And now I'm adjusting aperture. If you look at the back of your screen, those will be displayed on the back of your screen, where you can look. And I recommend really you get used to looking through the viewfinder to change your values, your aperture and your shutter speed. And get used to seeing those numbers at the bottom of the screen that you see, or the display you see inside the viewfinder. So on the Nikon camera, if I want to change the aperture, I turn that dial that's on the back while I'm using my thumb on a Nikon, and I press with my index finger on the AV button, which shows only the icon plus minus. So that's how I change aperture. So experiment with that on your camera. Make sure that you know where those things are, because you're going to want to be able to do that quickly. Okay? So that's choosing a mode you want to shoot in. How do you change aperture and shutter speed in manual and in the priority modes? And how do you change your ISO? So those are three very important things on an ongoing basis as we're going around taking pictures. So after you've taken your pictures, you want to take a look at them. So we need to look and find the review button. And on this Canon Rebel, the review button is on the lower right back. It's a little triangle. It looks like a play button in the old VCRs. So you press that, and the last image you took displays here on the LCD. If you want to see the image before that, you click on the 9 o'clock position right here on where the icon is on the Canon, and click it again, and it takes you to the image before that. If you want to go back to the image after that, you click on the 3 o'clock position. Same thing is true with the Nikon. Click on, except here the preview or review button is up in the upper left side of the back of the camera. It'll show you the last image that was shot, and then again, 9 o'clock position will take you to the one before that one, and 9 o'clock position click will take you to the one before that, and so on. But when you're looking at images, oftentimes you want to see some information about the image, like what was the shutter speed I used, what was the aperture I used, what time of the day did I take the picture, what was a variety of information is available. And sometimes it's there by default, but if it's not, then you need to bring it up. And the way you do that on a Nikon, at least on the Nikons that I'm familiar with, is with the image displayed here, you click on the 12 o'clock position on this dial, and it displays the EXIF data. It's like rolling up to the EXIF data, which is the shutter speed, the aperture, ISO, and so on. If you want to hide that information, you click on the 6 o'clock position. However, on the Canon, you click the info button. And by clicking the info button, it will take you through, cycle you through a couple different ways that the data is displayed. And one of those ways is no information at all. And that way you can really see the image. Okay, so that's the reviewing your images. And the last item we need to look at is the shutter button. Now, one thing before we go to the shutter button, this is my EM1. And on this camera and on some other cameras, there are two dials. So I have a rear dial and a forward dial. And the rear dial changes the shutter speed when I'm in manual, and the forward dial changes the aperture. So I don't have to press a button and dial. And I like that. That's one of the reasons I really like the Olympus cameras. Okay, so let's go to the Canon, and here's the shutter button. The shutter button, if you're walking around and you have not been using a camera for a couple minutes, it's probably gone to sleep. So there are three things that happen when you half press the shutter button. If you press it all the way, it takes a picture. By half pressing the shutter button, it wakes it up. And so the display will come back on the LCD screen. The camera's ready to go. Second thing that happens is it engages the autofocus mechanism. So if you've got it up to your eye, and you press half press the shutter button, it starts to focus on wherever where the focus point is. The third thing that happens is it wakes up the light meter that's built into your camera, and it starts evaluating the light that's available in the scene. Same thing is true with the Nikon, and the shutter button on the Nikon is in the same position. So that's a very common location for the shutter button, so you can hit it with your index finger. So that is physical controls, at least the ones we need to be sure we're really comfortable with before we really start taking pictures in the following episodes. So I encourage you, before we get on with that, roll up your sleeves, get your manual out, get your camera out, and go through it. The other thing I recommend is that you always make sure you have room in your card, and especially if you're going out and you don't have any other cards with you, and always make sure that you have a freshly charged battery. And I always recommend that people have at least 2 batteries, if not 3. These cameras have a lot of electronics in them, and therefore they need power, and they'll suck up your battery pretty quickly. So that is just a recommendation. So thank you very much for following me in these episodes, and I look forward to your joining me with episode 7 when we go out and start taking some pictures. Thank you very much.